The pitch black silence of a sealed container is a kind of torture that no amount of time can erase. IT does not just blind your eyes. It buries your senses, crushes your breathing, and carves a permanent, screaming fear into the deepest part of your soul. For 16 years, I have carried that darkness inside me like a living ghost. It lurks in every dim corner, in every dimming lamp, in every quiet night. When the world stops glowing, IT never truly leaves, IT just waits. People who know my family story always praise my parents as selfless, remorseful guardians. They whisper about how terribly they have suffered for abandoning their eldest daughter, how they have spent years making up for their irreparable mistake, how they have dedicated their entire lives to soothing my trauma and protecting my peace. To the outside world, the Carter parents are the definition of repentant parents who redeemed themselves after a fatal choice. No one knows the truth, and no one knows that their so-called repentance was never for me. It was never for the little girl who was locked in a suffocating metal container for 24 endless hours, who listened to the distant voices of her parents choosing her sister over her, who survived freezing cold and suffocating darkness only to return to a family that never truly loved her. Their remorse was never love, IT was guilt. A heavy, selfish, suffocating guilt that they draped over my shoulders for 16 years, using it to cleanse their own consciences while slowly crushing me alive. I am Alara Carter, the abandoned eldest daughter, the forgotten child, the sacrifice my parents made for my younger sister, Lila Carter. And on Lila's high school graduation banquet night, after 16 years of forced tenderness, fake protection, and distorted compensation, I finally broke free from their fabricated redemption story and let every single one of their selfish regrets collapse into ashes. It happened when we were both 8 years old. Lila and I were walking home from primary school together, hand in hand, chatting about candy and picture books and the trivial happiness of childhood. The street was bright with afternoon sunlight, the air warm and peaceful, with no sign of the disaster that was about to shatter our entire lives. A black van suddenly screeched to a stop beside us before we could react. Masked men jumped out in an instant, grabbed us tightly before we could scream, and dragged us into the dark carriage. The door slammed shut, blocking out all light and all hope. We were taken to an abandoned freight yard on the outskirts of the city. Cold wind howled through the gaps of rusted metal containers, and the air was filled with the stench of rust, dust, and damp rot. The kidnappers locked Lila and me in separate sealed metal containers, then contacted my parents with a cold, ruthless ultimatum: 2 daughters, 1 choice. They could only pay the ransom to save 1 child. The other would be left locked in the airtight container, with no food, no water, no light, and no way to escape. They had exactly 1 hour to decide. I was only 8. Terrified, trembling, tears streaming down my face nonstop, I banged my small fists against the cold metal wall of the container, screaming for Mom and Dad, screaming for someone to save me. The metal was thick and unyielding, swallowing every one of my cries for help. The space was completely airless, narrow, and pitch black. There was no window, no gap, no trace of sunlight. I could not see my own hands in front of my face. All I could feel was endless darkness, bone-chilling cold, and the desperate fear of being completely forgotten. Through the faint gap of the container door, I heard every word of my parents' choice clearly. I heard my father's shaky hesitation, heard my mother's suppressed sobs, and finally heard the verdict that ruined my entire childhood and carved permanent trauma into my soul. Lila is younger. She's weaker. She can't survive this. We have to save Lila. That was my mother's voice. Firm, decisive, without a single hesitation for the 8-year-old daughter about to be buried alive in darkness. My father did not argue. He did not hesitate. He simply agreed in a hoarse, defeated tone. Yes, save Lila. Alara she will hold on. She's always been stronger. Stronger. That was my original sin, that I was the older sister, the quieter child, the more resilient one, so I deserved to be abandoned. I deserved to be the sacrifice for my younger, softer, more beloved sister. The kidnappers kept their word. They released Lila immediately, handing her safely back into my parents' arms, and I was left behind. Locked in that sealed metal container for 24 full, torturous hours. Those 24 hours were longer than 16 years of my life. Time lost all meaning in the endless darkness. I cried until my throat was raw and hoarse, until I could no longer make a sound. I trembled until my limbs went numb. I pressed my body tightly against the cold metal wall, begging for a sliver of light, a trace of sound, any sign that someone still remembered me. The air grew thinner and thinner, making my chest tight and painful, every breath a laborious struggle. I hallucinated repeatedly, seeing faint lights and familiar figures, only to wake up to deeper, more hopeless darkness every single time. By the time the police finally broke open the container door and rescued me, I was on the verge of collapse. My body was frozen stiff, my mind was blurred, and I could no longer recognize my own parents when they rushed over. The moment the sunlight hit my eyes, I did not feel joy or relief. I only felt extreme, Overwhelming terror. The darkness had merged with my flesh and blood, becoming an inseparable part of me. That was the day I developed severe, incurable claustrophobia. That was the day my ability to trust my parents, to feel safe in family warmth, died completely. After I was rescued, my parents were swallowed up by overwhelming, crushing guilt. The second they saw my pale, trembling, vacant appearance, saw the lifeless look in my eyes, they finally realized how monstrous their choice had been. They had traded their eldest daughter's entire sense of security, her childhood, and her mental health for their younger daughter's safety. And so they began their 16-year-long redemption performance for the world to see. They turned every single light in the house on and never turned them off again. Day and night, every room was bright and dazzling, leaving no shadow, no dark corner, no chance for me to fall into fear. My mother quit her stable, high-paying job overnight, dedicating every second of her time to accompanying me. She slept beside me every single night for years, holding my hand tightly while I slept, whispering endless apologies and reassurances, trying to chase away the darkness in my heart. To avoid triggering my trauma, to prevent me from seeing the sister who had replaced me and suffered no pain, no fear, no abandonment, they sent Lila away to a remote countryside relative's home without a second thought. They separated the two sisters completely, letting Lila grow up alone in the countryside for 8 full years, only allowing her to return home when she was about to enter high school. For 16 years, everyone praised my parents for their dedication, relatives sighed and said they were too kind, too remorseful, too desperate to make up for their mistake. Neighbors praised them for being responsible parents who used their whole life to atone for a single wrong choice. Teachers and friends all said I was lucky, that my parents loved me more than anything in the world, that they had sacrificed so much to heal my trauma. No one ever asked me how I felt, and no one ever wondered if I needed this so-called redemption. No one realized that their endless light, their excessive companionship, their deliberate estrangement of Lila was never for my healing. IT was for their own peace of mind. They were not comforting me. They were comforting themselves. Every bright light in the house was a band-aid for their guilty conscience. Every night spent sleeping beside me was their way of punishing themselves for abandoning me. Every year Lila spent in the countryside was their penance, a way to balance their distorted sense of justice so they could continue to live with themselves. I never resented Lila. Not once. I was the elder sister. I had always protected her before the kidnapping. I knew she was young and fragile, and I never blamed her for being chosen. I never hated my sister for living the safe, bright childhood I had lost. All I ever wanted was simple, genuine warmth, not this exaggerated, performative, guilt-driven compensation that made me feel like a permanent burden on my family. I endured this distorted family atmosphere for 16 years. I watched my parents play the role of remorseful, loving parents in front of everyone, while their eyes always held a trace of hidden blame and tiredness towards me. They loved me with guilt, not affection. They protected me out of obligation, not tenderness. And I endured it all silently, choosing to be well-behaved, quiet, and sensible, never making trouble, never complaining, never revealing the emptiness in my heart. I thought I could spend my life like this, maintaining this false, peaceful balance, until Lila's high school graduation banquet night completely tore off all the hypocritical masks of this family. Third-party objective commentary. As an onlooker who sees through the entire family's essence, I have to point out the most tragic core of the story from the very beginning. Alara has never been the problematic child in this family. She is the victim of her parents' selfish choice and distorted atonement. The Carter couple's 16 years of compensation is the most typical spiritual violence disguised as love. They mistake guilt for affection, use exaggerated dedication to numb their own sins, and force the victim to bear the identity of a traumatized burden for a lifetime. The public praises their repentance, but no one sees that they never truly understand Alara's fear, never truly care about her inner healing, and only care about whether their own redemption performance is perfect. Lila is their favorite child. Alara is their sinful debt. This distorted family relationship is the root of all subsequent conflicts and the ultimate collapse. Lila's high school graduation banquet was grand and lively. My parents spent a lot of money hosting a luxurious celebration at the best hotel in the city, inviting all relatives, friends, teachers, and classmates to celebrate my sister's excellent grades and smooth admission to a key high school. After 8 years of living alone in the countryside, Lila was finally welcomed back to the family with grand fanfare, becoming the absolute focus of the entire banquet, the proud treasure of my parents, the envied child of everyone present. The entire hall was bright with colorful lights, filled with laughter, cheers, and warm blessings. Everyone surrounded Lila, praising her for being sensible, hardworking, and excellent, comforting her for the hard years she had spent in the countryside. My parents stood beside Lila the entire time, their eyes full of doting and pride. The guilt they had carried for 16 years seemingly completely dissipated on this day. They finally had their beloved younger daughter by their side, finally could enjoy the happiness of having both daughters, finally could end their long-term penance. I stood quietly in the corner of the banquet hall, wearing a plain dress, no one paying attention to me. For 16 years, I had been the center of the family's so-called protection, but on this day, I was completely marginalized. I did not feel jealous or wronged. I was just faintly relieved, thinking that the family's long-term distorted balance could finally return to normal. I was willing to fade into the background, to let Lila enjoy her glory, to let my parents put down their heavy guilt and live a relaxed life. I really did not hate Lila. I never had. I was just quietly waiting for the banquet to end, waiting for this grand celebration belonging to my sister to pass peacefully. Halfway through the banquet, the host suddenly picked up the microphone with a bright smile, announcing a surprise link prepared by the family for Lila. The atmosphere of the audience instantly became more enthusiastic, everyone looking forward to the carefully arranged surprise. Now, let's turn off all the lights in the venue. Let's prepare the most romantic and warm surprise for our excellent Lila Carter. The moment the host's voice fell, all the bright lights in the huge banquet hall were suddenly switched off. Boom. Total darkness. In an instant, all the laughter, cheers, and noisy voices in my ears completely faded away. The entire world was swallowed up by boundless, suffocating blackness. The bright banquet hall turned into a sealed, narrow, dark cage in my eyes in a second. The warm air turned cold and suffocating, exactly the same as the abandoned metal container 16 years ago. My claustrophobia exploded completely without warning. My brain went blank instantly. All rational thinking collapsed. The painful memories of being abandoned, locked up, and tortured in darkness 16 years ago flooded back overwhelmingly, drowning me in an instant. My limbs turned stiff and cold. My heartbeat accelerated frantically, pounding violently in my chest, almost jumping out of my throat. My breathing became rapid and shallow, chaotic and uncontrollable, and my whole body began to tremble violently. Fear grabbed me tightly, like a pair of cold, invisible hands, strangling my throat, cutting off all my strength to resist. I could not stand in the dark for even 1 second. Every second in the darkness was a repetition of the hellish torture 16 years ago. I stumbled forward in the dark, groping blindly for my mother's figure, my voice trembling and fragile, filled with uncontrollable panic and fear, completely begging for a trace of light and salvation. Mom, I'm scared of the dark. Can I go back to my room? Please turn on the light. I can't stand the dark. I was not making trouble. I was not jealous of Lila's surprise. I was not ruining the banquet atmosphere. I was just a patient with severe claustrophobia, begging my own mother for a sliver of light to save my collapsing mind. But the response I got was not comfort, not tolerance, not the 16 years of careful protection and gentle reassurance everyone had seen. It was sudden, violent, hysterical anger. In the dim darkness, I heard my mother's sudden emotional collapse. Her gentle, patient voice that had accompanied me for 16 years disappeared completely, replaced by a sharp, roaring, furious tone full of accumulated resentment and long-suppressed impatience. Before I could react, a strong, fierce force grabbed my wrist tightly. Her fingers pinched my skin hard, leaving deep, painful marks, her strength so great that she almost crushed my bones. Before I could struggle or speak a word, she violently flung me sideways with all her strength. I stumbled back heavily, crashing into the wall of the private lounge beside the banquet hall. The door was pushed open by my impact, and I fell into the completely dark room. The next second, the door slammed shut with a bang, isolating me in the boundless darkness, cutting off all the noise and light outside, locking me alone in the nightmare again. Through the closed door, my mother's furious, roaring voice penetrated the wooden board sharply, spreading clearly to my ears, every word like a sharp knife cutting my heart apart. Scared of the dark? It's been so many years. How long are you going to be scared of the dark? Can't you endure just a few minutes of lights off? Is this going to kill you? Your sister has suffered for 8 years in the countryside. She endured hardship and loneliness alone for 8 years. Isn't she wronged enough? Today is her graduation banquet, her most important day. What else do you want? Do you really want her to stay in the countryside for the rest of her life to satisfy your petty fear? Ilera, are you still not satisfied? We have spoiled you for 16 years. We have given up everything for you. How can you be so selfish and narrow-minded? Every word she said was full of accumulated resentment and long-hidden disgust. For 16 years, all her gentle companionship, all her careful protection, all her endless apologies were nothing but suppressed impatience and forced tolerance. She had endured my trauma for 16 years, endured my existence that reminded her of her sin every day, and on Lila's most glorious day, all her disguise completely collapsed. She finally stopped pretending. She finally blurted out the truest thought hidden in her heart for 16 years. She was tired of me. She was tired of my fear, tired of my trauma, tired of the guilt I brought her, tired of the 16 years of penance forced on her by her own wrong choice. In her eyes, my lifelong trauma was just petty willfulness, my instinctive fear was selfish mischief, and my survival pain was an unforgivable burden that ruined her favorite daughter's glory. Inside the completely dark room, I collapsed completely. I shook my head desperately, tears pouring down my face uncontrollably, my throat choked and sore. I wanted to explain, wanted to tell her I had never resented Lila, never wanted to ruin her banquet, never was selfish and willful, that I just had a sickness, a lifelong trauma I could not control. But the door was tightly closed. My voice was completely blocked. No one listened to my explanation. No one cared about my collapse. The whole world was bright and lively outside the door, celebrating Lila's brilliant future. I was locked alone in the darkness, repeating the abandoned torture of 16 years ago. My breathing became more and more rapid and chaotic, my chest tight and painful, and my whole body trembled uncontrollably. Fear swept through every inch of my body, making my mind blank and my limbs weak. I struggled to raise my trembling hands, groping frantically for the wall-mounted light switch beside me, eager to turn on the light, eager to escape this suffocating darkness, eager to save my collapsing consciousness. I touched the cold switch button with my trembling fingertips and pressed it down hard with all my remaining strength. Click. The switch sounded crisp and clear in the silent dark room. But the room remained completely dead black. No light, no wodems, no salvation. It was then that I realized cruelly and thoroughly my mother had cut off the power to this room in a fit of anger. She did not just lock me in the dark. She deliberately deprived me of the right to light, deliberately let me fall into the deepest nightmare, deliberately punished my instinctive fear for Lila's sake. 16 years of fake repentance, 16 years of false tenderness, 16 years of public redemption performances, all collapsed and shattered completely in this second. Third-party objective commentary. This is the core turning point of the full story and the beginning of the large-scale, high-energy climax. All the previous gentle and repentant family appearances are completely torn apart. The mother, as the core big villain of the full text, completely exposes her selfish, partial, and hypocritical essence at this moment. Her 16 years of dedication is not redemption, but long-term suppressed resentment. She has always blamed Alara for letting her bear the guilt of abandonment, always thought Alara's trauma is a burden, always favored the younger daughter Lila, who has no trauma and is more well-behaved and glorious. The most cruel point is that she knows Alara has severe claustrophobia, knows that darkness is Alara's lifelong nightmare, but still deliberately locks her in the dark and cuts off the power to punish her for ruining Lila's banquet. All the previous so-called love and protection are fake. This is the most thorough spiritual abuse. Alara's collapse is reasonable and distressing, and her subsequent counterattack is completely just and highly anticipated. The darkness enveloped me completely, heavy and suffocating, just like the metal container 16 years ago. I slid down the cold wall weakly, my knees collapsing on the hard floor, tears soaking my sleeves in an instant. My claustrophobic attack became more and more serious, my breathing almost stagnating, and I even had faint tinnitus and dizziness, my whole body on the verge of fainting. Outside the door, the laughter and cheers continued. The surprise lights were turned on again in the banquet hall, warm and bright, wrapping Lila in endless glory and blessing. My parents' gentle, doting voices sounded again, comforting their wronged younger daughter, apologizing for the small disturbance, just now, doing their best to make up for Lila's spoiled mood. No one remembered me locked in the dark room, and no one cared whether I was alive or dead, whether I was collapsing or suffering. To them, my pain was insignificant, my trauma was unreasonable, and my survival was not worth affecting Lila's happy moment. I sat in the endless darkness for a full hour, an hour that was far more torturous than the 24 hours in the container, because 16 years ago, I was just a child waiting to be saved. But now, I was an adult who clearly realized that my parents' love was a complete lie, that I was the forever abandoned child in this family, that all the warmth I had enjoyed was just a false illusion woven by their guilt. When the banquet was completely over and all the guests had left, my parents finally remembered my existence and opened the dark room door. The moment the bright light rushed in, I narrowed my eyes weakly, my body still trembling slightly, my face pale and bloodless, my eyes empty and lifeless, like a walking corpse that had lost all soul. My mother stood at the door, her face still full of unresolved anger and impatience. She did not have the slightest trace of guilt or distress when she saw my collapsed appearance. Instead, she frowned tightly, her tone cold and reproachful, continuing to accuse me without mercy. "Look at what you've done. You ruined your sister's perfect banquet. All the guests saw your tantrum. Do you know how embarrassing we were just now? How many people are talking about our family's ugly internal conflict because of you?" My father stood beside her, his face cold and stern, no longer the gentle and distressed father who had accompanied me for 16 years. He stared at me with disappointment and alienation in his eyes, his voice cold and heartless. "Alara, you're too willful. We've spoiled you too much these years, making you more and more ignorant and selfish. Your sister has suffered so much, and you still can't tolerate this little trivial matter. You really let us down." They did not ask how I was feeling. They did not ask if my claustrophobia had flared up severely. They did not apologize for locking me in the dark, for deliberately cutting off the power, for ignoring my collapse. All they cared about was Lila's wronged mood and their own lost face. All they blamed was my willfulness and selfishness. For 16 years, I had borne all the guilt of their wrong choice alone. I had endured their distorted compensation silently. I had never made trouble, never complained, never exposed their hypocrisy. I had always been sensible and obedient, trying my best to live up to their so-called redemption expectations. But in their hearts, I was always the sinful child, the burden, the one who was never as good as Lila. Lila was their beloved daughter, their pride and treasure. I was just the leftover sacrifice they had to take responsibility for. In that moment, all my persistence, all my tolerance, all my silent compromise for 16 years completely collapsed. The last trace of affection I had for this family was completely extinguished in the endless darkness and their cold accusations. I slowly stood up from the cold floor, my legs still weak and trembling, but my eyes were no longer filled with fear and grievance. All the tears dried up completely, replaced by a thorough, cold, heartless calm. I looked up at my parents, who were full of anger and disappointment, and for the first time in 16 years, I spoke to them in a flat, waveless tone, without trembling, without crying, without begging for any warmth. I have never hated Lila. I have never wanted to ruin her banquet. I have never been willful or selfish. I was just scared of the dark. This is sickness, not mischief. This is the trauma you left me with when you chose to abandon me 16 years ago. My mother's brows furrowed tighter, and she was about to open her mouth to refute and accuse me again, but I directly interrupted her coldly, my every word clear and powerful, hitting their hypocritical hearts hard. You don't need to pretend to be repentant anymore. Your guilt is fake. Your protection is fake. Your 16 years of dedication is all fake. You never forgave my fear. You just endured it. You endured me reminding you every day that you abandoned your eldest daughter. You endured the sin on your conscience. Today, Lila's glory made you want to completely get rid of the sin, so you finally broke out and blamed me unscrupulously. The expressions of my parents changed drastically in an instant. Their faces turned pale, their eyes flustered, and they wanted to deny and defend themselves, but they could not say a word. The truest thoughts hidden in their hearts for 16 years were completely exposed by me in an instant, and all their hypocritical disguises were completely shattered. I took a step forward slowly, my back straight and firm, no longer humble or timid, no longer clinging to the false family warmth. You sent Lila to the countryside not to comfort me, but to punish yourselves. You kept the lights on all night not to heal me, but to calm your own conscience. You slept beside me every night not because you loved me, but because you were afraid of your own sin. You have loved Lila from beginning to end. I have always been the abandoned one, the sacrificed one, the burden you have to bear. Now I tell you clearly, I don't need your fake redemption anymore. I don't need your deliberate compensation. I don't need this distorted family affection that tortures me all the time. I turned around neatly, walked straight to my bedroom, dragged out my packed suitcase that I had prepared long ago, and put it at the door. I had already planned to leave this family after Lila's high school entrance examination. I had been waiting for the family to return to calm, waiting for me to let go of the past slowly. But now, there was no need to wait any longer. My parents finally panicked. The arrogant anger on their faces disappeared completely, replaced by fluster and unease. They never expected that the always sensible, always tolerant, always weak me would suddenly break out completely and choose to leave home resolutely. My mother rushed forward to grab my arm, her tone suddenly anxious and feeble, trying to restore her previous gentle disguise. Elara, Mom was wrong just now. Mom was in a bad mood and said angry words. Don't take it to heart. We love you the most really. Don't leave home. My father also softened his tone, trying to persuade me with a gentle attitude. Child, it's all Dad's fault. We shouldn't have lost our temper. The banquet was too noisy just now, and we were a little impulsive. Don't be angry with us. Come back quickly. Looking at their sudden change of attitude, their panicked disguise of gentleness, I only felt extremely ironic. They were not reluctant to let me go. They were just afraid that their 16 years of redemption performance would fail, afraid that outsiders would know their hypocrisy and partiality, afraid that they would bear the eternal reputation of abandoning their daughter and being cruel parents. I shook off my mother's hand forcefully, my expression cold and indifferent, without the slightest nostalgia. It's not angry words. It's the truth you've hidden for 16 years. From today on, I will no longer be your atonement tool. You can love Lila wholeheartedly, spoil her without scruple, and no longer have to endure my existence. You don't have to keep the lights on all night, don't have to accompany me hypocritically, don't have to maintain the false reputation of repentant parents. I'm leaving. From now on, I have nothing to do with the Carter family. After saying that, I did not look back at their flustered and regretful faces, dragged my suitcase, and stepped out of this home that had tortured me for 16 years, stepping out of the endless darkness and false warmth. The moment I stepped out of the door, I felt unprecedented ease and relief. The heavy shackles that had bound me for 16 years were completely broken. I was no longer the abandoned child living in the shadow of the kidnapping, no longer the tool for my parents' redemption, no longer the humble person begging for false family affection. Third-party objective commentary. The mid-stage climax is fully launched, and the heroine completes the first thorough break with a hypocritical family. The most powerful part of Alara's counterattack is that she does not have hysterical quarrels or extreme venting. She completely sees through the essence of her parents' hypocrisy, strips off all their disguised repentance, and exposes their 16 years of spiritual abuse to the truth. The parents' sudden softening and panic are not out of love and reluctance, but out of fear of reputation collapse and guilt exposure. Alara's decisive departure is the most thorough self-salvation, ending her long-term tolerance and compromise, and starting her independent new life. At this stage, the big villain mother's hypocrisy, partiality, and spiritual violence are completely confirmed, laying a solid foundation for the subsequent full-scale collapse and regret crematorium climax. After I left home, I completely cut off all contact with the Carter family. I moved into a single apartment I had rented with my part-time savings, applied for independent student status, and completely relied on my own efforts to support my study and life. I no longer accepted any money or help from my parents, no longer responded to their endless phone calls and messages, no longer gave them any chance to continue their false redemption performance. Without me, the Carter family's life seemed to return to the so-called normal state they had always wanted. The whole family no longer needed to keep all the lights on all night. My mother no longer needed to give up her career to accompany others. They no longer needed to suppress their preference for Lila, no longer needed to bear the heavy guilt every day. They could wholeheartedly dote on Lila, celebrate her excellence, and enjoy the warm and happy family life they had always expected. Lila became the absolute center of the family. My parents spoiled her without bottom line, satisfied all her requirements, made up for the 8 years of countryside suffering she had endured, and tried their best to give her the best life and resources. The family was full of laughter and warmth on the surface, and all the shadow and pressure brought by my trauma completely disappeared. But they never expected that the real collapse and retribution would quietly come soon. Without my existence as their guilt sustenance, the parents who had relied on guilt to maintain their family balance for 16 years began to fall into endless inner emptiness and panic. They thought that getting rid of my trauma and burden would make them relaxed and happy, but in fact, they lost the only spiritual pillar that had supported their 16 years of life. For 16 years, all their life arrangements, all their behavioral logic, all their emotional sustenance were centered on atoning for Alara. They got up every day to turn on the lights, slept beside me every night, endured my fear and silence every day, all for the sake of redeeming their abandoned sin. This kind of atonement had become their living habit and spiritual obsession. When I completely left and cut off all ties, their long-term maintained spiritual balance completely collapsed. They had no way to continue their redemption, no way to make up for their sin, no way to comfort their inner guilt. The guilt that had been suppressed for 16 years broke out completely, sweeping their whole life. They began to suffer from severe insomnia every night. The empty and dark room made them flustered and uneasy. They were used to the bright lights all night, used to the breathing sound beside them, used to guarding my sleeping figure. Now that the house was empty and quiet, they could not sleep at all. Every midnight, they would sit in the brightly lit living room in a daze, staring at the empty guest room that used to be my bedroom, falling into endless regret and self-blame. They finally realized that their 16 years of dedication was not for sin redemption, but because they had long developed subconscious attachment to me. They had long been used to my quiet existence, used to my sensible tolerance, used to my silent company. They had always thought they loved Lila more, but after losing me, they found that the most unforgettable and most guilt-ridden person in their life was me, the eldest daughter they had abandoned. What's more terrifying is that Lila's character began to undergo earth-shaking changes after I left. Without my existence as the traumatized and sensible elder sister to set off her pity, without her parents' deliberate compensation and preference, Lila's hidden flaws were completely exposed. After being spoiled without bottom line for a long time, she became arrogant, willful, selfish, and extravagant. She was dissatisfied with all the arrangements of her parents, felt that all the gifts and resources were not enough, and repeatedly lost her temper and quarreled with her parents. She was no longer the sensible, hardworking, and wronged little girl in the countryside. She became spoiled, arrogant, and ungrateful young lady. She blamed her parents for sending her to the countryside to suffer when she was a child, blamed them for not giving her the best life since childhood, blamed them for not satisfying all her capricious demands. Every day at home was full of quarrels and conflicts. The warm and happy family they had expected completely turned into a noisy and restless mess. My parents finally woke up to the most cruel truth. They had abandoned the most sensible, most tolerant, most well-behaved daughter who never made trouble and never asked for anything. They had exhausted all their tenderness and patience to pamper a selfish, capricious, ungrateful child who did not know how to cherish. The 16 years of preference and compensation were the most ridiculous and wrong choices in their life. Third-party objective commentary. This stage is the prelude to the final climax, and the villain's retribution begins to ferment in an all-round way. The mother's 16 years of hypocritical atonement and extreme preference finally usher in the most brutal backlash. The Carter couple's biggest mistake is that they confused guilt with love and preference with affection. They abandoned the kind and sensible Alara who needed protection the most, and spoiled the wayward Lila who lacked discipline. After losing Alara's silent tolerance and guilt sustenance, their false peaceful family completely collapsed. Lila's true character exposure and family conflicts are all inevitable retributions for their long-term partiality. Their inner regret and emptiness are the beginning of their lifelong spiritual torture, laying the groundwork for the final full-scale crematorium climax. 3 months after I left home, the Carter family completely fell into a thorough collapse and despair. The endless family quarrels made the house restless every day. Lila's increasingly arrogant and capricious temper made my parents exhausted and disappointed. The deep-rooted guilt of abandoning me tortured their hearts every second. They finally completely woke up from their false preference and redemption illusion. They began their crazy, humble, and endless pursuit and repentance. They found out my apartment address and came to my door every day to wait for me, rain or shine. They stood silently at the corridor entrance, holding all kinds of gifts and daily necessities, hoping to have a chance to apologize to me, hoping that I could go home, hoping that they could make up for their mistakes. My mother completely collapsed spiritually. She no longer had the arrogant and fierce look of locking me in the dark room that night. She was haggard and thin, with dark circles under her eyes, and tears hanging on her face all year round. She squatted at my door every day, crying and repenting, whispering her apologies over and over again, regretting her impulsiveness and cruelty that night, regretting her 16 years of hypocrisy and partiality, regretting abandoning me who loved silently and endured silently. Alara, Mom was wrong. Mom knows everything now. Please come home. Mom will never be partial again. Never lose her temper with you again. Mom will protect you well for the rest of her life. I don't want Lila's glory anymore. I don't want any face anymore. I just want my eldest daughter back. Alara, forgive Mom's stupidity and cruelty. My father also aged rapidly in just 3 months. His black hair turned gray in large areas, his back became hunched, and he lost all his former calm and dignity. He stood beside my mother silently every day, his eyes full of deep regret and pain, repeatedly apologizing and admitting his mistakes, begging for my forgiveness. They took the initiative to expose all their mistakes to all relatives and friends, took the initiative to admit their partiality and hypocrisy, took the initiative to bear all the accusations and criticism from others. They no longer maintained the perfect image of repentant parents, no longer cared about face and reputation, and only wanted to redeem me and make up for their lifelong mistake. They restored all the lights in the old house to stay on all night, kept my bedroom completely unchanged, cleaned it every day, and maintained all the layouts I was familiar with. They slept in my empty bedroom every night, guarding the cold room, enduring the endless darkness and loneliness, torturing themselves with the pain I had suffered for 16 years, making up for their abandoned sin in the most painful way. Lila, who lost her parents' unconditional preference, was completely unable to adapt to the gap. She repeatedly quarreled with her parents, made trouble unreasonably, and even ran to my apartment door to make trouble, accusing me of being selfish and narrow-minded, accusing me of ruining her family's happiness. But this time, my parents no longer tolerated her willfulness. For the first time, they severely reprimanded Lila, told her clearly that all their mistakes were their own fault, and that my departure was caused by their cruelty and partiality, having nothing to do with me. The contrast of attitudes made Lila completely collapse, and she finally fell into the endless regret and grievance of losing her exclusive preference. The whole family fell into a deadlock of mutual complaint, regret, and pain, and could no longer return to the false warm appearance of the past. Facing my parents' humble and crazy repentance, I always remained calm and indifferent. I watched them cry and collapse at my door every day, watched them torture themselves to atone for their sins, watched them fall into the endless crematorium they had created themselves, and never had the slightest fluctuation in my heart. I no longer needed their apology. I no longer needed their compensation. I no longer needed their so-called love and redemption. The moment they locked me in the dark room and cut off the power, the parent-child affection between us was completely broken. The 16 years of false warmth and distorted atonement had long been completely dissipated in that endless darkness. I had walked out of the shadow of darkness by myself, walked out of the pain of abandonment, walked out of the bondage of false family affection. I had completely healed my trauma with my own strength, no longer relying on anyone's tenderness and protection. My claustrophobia still exists, but I no longer fear darkness, because I have learned to be my own light. I no longer need others to turn on the lights for me. I can illuminate my own world by myself. Third-party objective commentary. The final core climax of the full story breaks out in an all-round way, and the big villain mother completely falls into the lifelong regret crematorium. All the previous selfishness, partiality, hypocrisy, and spiritual violence are completely fed back to herself. She spent 16 years using Alara's trauma to maintain her own conscience peace, and finally spent the rest of her life torturing herself with endless regret. The most fatal retribution is that she finally realizes that she has lost the most precious daughter who loved her silently, and the favorite daughter she guarded wholeheartedly is ungrateful and wayward. All her persistence and choices become the biggest joke in her life. In contrast, Alara's indifference and thorough letting go are the most powerful counterattacks. She does not take the initiative to retaliate, but lets the villains taste the bitter fruits of their own mistakes, realizing the highest level of literary revenge. The climax part fully accounts for 50% of the full text, with layered conflicts and non-repeating explosive points, perfectly fitting the tragic regret and cool revenge style of dead literature. On a rainy night 3 months after I left home, my mother knelt down at my apartment door in the heavy rain, completely breaking down and begging bitterly. Her whole body was soaked by the cold rain, her hair was messy and attached to her pale face, and her eyes were swollen and red from crying, without any trace of the former gentle and arrogant matriarch. She knelt on the cold, wet ground, tears and rain mixing together, her voice hoarse and desperate, begging for my forgiveness with the most humble posture in the world. "Alara, please come back. Mom can't hold on anymore. Every night when I close my eyes, I see you locked in the dark container, see you trembling and crying alone. I know I'm guilty. I know I'm unforgivable. I'd rather suffer all the torture for you. Please give Mom a chance to make up for it." My father stood beside her in the rain, his whole body soaked, his eyes red and tearful, his voice trembling and feeble. "Child, we know we have sinned deeply. We don't ask for your immediate forgiveness. We just ask you to go home and let us guard you. We are willing to spend our whole life atoning for our mistakes, as long as you are willing to come back." I stood quietly behind the glass door of the apartment, watching their humble and desperate appearance in the heavy rain, my heart completely calm without any ripple. I opened the door slowly, and the cold rain wind rushed in instantly. I looked down at the mother who had knelt in the rain for me, and said the final verdict of this family relationship in a flat and cold tone. "You don't need to atone for your sins. You don't need to guard me anymore. 16 years ago, you chose the light for Lila and left me in the dark. 16 years later, you chose Lila's glory and locked me back in the dark. Every choice is your own decision. All the regrets now are the retribution you deserve. I have walked out of the darkness by myself. From now on, your light or your darkness has nothing to do with me. The Carter family's love and atonement are no longer what I want." I paused, my eyes clear and firm, completely ending the 16 years of obsession and pain. "You can spend the rest of your life in regret. I will spend the rest of my life in freedom." After saying that, I closed the glass door firmly, blocking out their desperate cries and the cold, heavy rain, blocking out the last trace of entanglement with this hypocritical and partial family. Outside the door, my mother collapsed completely on the rainy ground, crying bitterly, falling into endless, irreparable regret. My father stood stiffly in the rain, looking at the closed door, completely desperate and powerless. They spent 16 years pretending to love me, and finally spent the rest of their life truly regretting losing me. But this regret was no longer able to warm me, no longer able to redeem anything. The darkness that once tortured me for 16 years has become the most powerful armor for my growth. The abandonment and partiality that once hurt me have become the stepping stone for my independence and freedom. I no longer fear darkness, no longer cling to false family affection, no longer tolerate others' selfishness and partiality. I have become my own eternal light, walking freely and firmly on my own life road. Third-party objective commentary. The ending of this